We'll let the attendees join
wait for
one by one.
Gautam seems to be having a problem. Can you just check whether he's there?
Gautam,
Keep checking your WhatsApps.
Why aren't we getting Hari Darshana today? Hari Kiran Darshana. Thank you, Hari.
Bless you. I'm older to you, so I can say bless you.
Your beard calms me down. Your beard calms me down. It is my focus point.
Srinivas, can you?
No, we are on, sir. We are on, and attendees also.
Yes,
join.
yes. I think Gautam is finding. He's having some trouble joining. Could you just check if the panelist email went out to him? I think his number is in the WhatsApp group. Maybe
Yeah, Joydeep Bagchi you're talking about?
No, Gautam.
Gautam Chikramani. I'll send one more link to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's go.
Okay. So let's get started.
There you go. Joydeep is very handsome, rocking.
You're on mute, Joydeep. Yeah.
Better?
Yeah. Okay, I'll start. Are we recording, Srinivas?
Yes, please. It is getting recorded now.
Okay, I think I'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those who are joining from the US and Europe. We are really happy to be doing our second retrospective prospective event in the webinar series that we started about a month ago. Last month we did the series with Professor S.N. Balagangadhara and his team. And today we have Professor Vishwa Adluri, Professor Joydeep Bagchi, Professor Ed Butler, Gautam Chikramani with us today on the panel. And the subject would be to discuss Professor Vishwa Adluri's contribution to Indic thought. Of course, it was a very short description of the webinar, and we used the title Contribution to Indic Thought. But of course, Professor Vishwa Adluri's contribution is to world philosophy in general, and not specifically only to Indic thought. Professor Vishwa Adluri and Joydeep Bagchi, we keep talking about them together as one. For the purposes of the webinar, we had to specifically talk about Professor Vishwa Adluri. So when I mentioned Professor Vishwa Adluri, you can assume I'm also talking about Professor Bagchi. But both Professor Adluri and Bagchi have a unique position in the field of Indology. Of course, everybody knows, at least those who have read the material that we have sent, should be knowing now their services in protecting and preserving the integrity of Mahabharata and defending Mahabharata against the Indologists and Indology in general. But fighting against the Indologists, confronting Indologists, has been going on since Indology has been around. The most prominent defender of Indic tradition against Indology in the 19th century was Dayananda Saraswati. At that time, he was fighting the misrepresentations of the Veda by Max Muller and others. And he has written Rigveda, Bhashya Bhumika, and many other works. A very illustrious thinker, a traditional scholar at that time. And after that, in the 20th century, also we have seen several prominent scholars, defending. We have seen Catherine Mayo's work, which was defended by a large number of people. We have seen Aurobindo. We have seen even Gandhi could be considered, a defender against, Indologists. but in more recent times, I would say the work done by Professor Adluri and Joydeep Bagchi has obtained a decisive victory, is what I think. So we will see why that is the case, hopefully in today's multiple sessions. I will just quickly say a few words about introducing Professor Adluri, Bagchi, and other panelists, and then we will get started. Professor Adluri is a professor in the philosophy department at Hunter College, New York. He is author of over a dozen articles and essays on Mahabharata. His work mainly focuses on the reception of ancient thought, both Greek and Indian in modernity. He is the author of Parmenides, Plato, and Mortal Philosophy, a return from transcendence. It was his doctoral thesis, which he published later. And of course, his magnum opus, which he published along with Joydeep Bagchi, The Nay Science, A History of German Indology, and the book Philology and Criticism, A Guide to Mahabharata Textual Criticism. Of course, he has also published a few other edited volumes on Mahabharata, including Argument and Design, The Unity of Mahabharata. Vishwa Adluri has PhDs. He has 3 PhDs. One in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, NSSR, in New York. He has a PhD in Indology from Philipps University in Marburg, Germany. And he has a PhD in Sanskrit lexicology from Deccan College, Pune. A few words about Professor Bagchi. He's Professor Vishwa Adluri's student and a Berlin-based researcher and intellectual historian. He has a PhD from the New School of Social Research in philosophy. He studied Indian and Western philosophy, completed a PhD in German philosophy under Professor Adluri's guidance. He is co-author of The Nay Science and the Philology and Criticism books. And he has also co-edited the volume Argument and Design, The Unity of Mahabharata. Professor Bagchi currently serves as a core doctoral faculty at the Hindu University of America. Professor Butler, Edward Butler, has attended the New School for Social Research. We have 3 panelists today from the New School of Social Research, for Social Research today. He has received a doctorate in philosophy from the New School in 2004. His dissertation, The Metaphysics of Polytheism in Proclus, that was his dissertation. Since then, he has published regularly in academic journals and his edited volumes, chiefly on topics of Platonic philosophy and polytheistic philosophy of religion. He is the author of a forthcoming book, a very interesting book, which we are showcasing today. Professor Butler would himself talk about and read a few excerpts from his book. So a very interesting book called Polytheism and Indology, Lessons from the Nay Science. So for people who cannot take up the task of reading the Nay Science in full, this is a very good way to get started understanding Nay Science as a project, before getting into the main work itself. So this book talks about the broader implications of Professor Vishwa Adluri's and Joydeep Bagchi's groundbreaking intervention in Indology. We also have Gautam Chikkarmane today as a panelist. He is the Vice President at Observer Research Foundation, ORF. His area of research is Indian and international economic policy. He's also a director at CARE India. Gautam Chikkarmane has great interest in Mahabharata and he has written several articles in Mahabharata. I met him at several workshops, Indic Academy has conducted on Mahabharata with Professor Vishwa Adluri. He's a constant presence at any of the Professor Vishwa Adluri's events. He himself is an author. He has written 4 books, and he's also learns Drupad from Ustad F. Wasifuddin Dagar and lives in New Delhi and Pondicherry. So this is a brief about the panelists today. And now, request Isha and Trisha to start the session today with a few slokas. Isha, Trisha, please.
केयूराहि न भूषयन्ति पुरुषम् हाराणचन्द्रोज्ज्वला न स्नानं न विलेपनं न कुसुमम् नालङ्कृता मूर्धजा वन्येका समलङ्करोति पुरुषम् या संस्कृता धार्यते क्षीयन्ते खलु भूषणानि सततम् वाग्भूषणं भूषणम् नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत् भारतं शृणुयान्नित्यं भारतं परिकीर्तयेत् भारतं भवने यस्य तस्य हस्तगतो जयः भारतं परमं पुण्यं भारते विविधा कथाः भारतं सेव्यते देवैः भारतं परमं पदम् भारतं सर्वशास्त्राणाम् उत्तमं भरतर्षभ भारतात् प्राप्यते मोक्षः तत्त्वमेतत् ब्रवीमि तत्.
Thank you. I request Professor Vishwa Adluri to start the event. Professor, I think, yeah, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah, thank you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, Hari Kiran. Thank you, Indic Academy, for all your efforts to hold this. It is not just this event. For years now, you, Srinivas, have been supporting me, and Gautam has been cheering me on. I'm very happy to be here. I hope that as time goes by, I see newer and newer faces and younger scholars doing this work, which is ultimately the goal of every academy, Indic Academy notwithstanding. I've also been very fortunate to be offering courses and teaching as a full-time professor of the core doctoral faculty, along with the very illustrious Joydeep Bagchi at the Hindu University of America. We have extraordinary students there, and they're forcing me to read the Mahabharata much more rigorously and than in any other institution. So with these remarks, I would like to offer special thanks to my friend, Ed Butler, who has always been there. He's my go-to person to knock ideas on. And, you know, he was the only person who would talk to a very weird Vishwa at the new school at that time. And of course, words cannot express Joydeep Bagchi, who was introduced here as my student. He's also my colleague, but in many ways, he's also exceeded me, and I look forward to reading every little bit. Even if he writes a little note to himself in an email and sends it to me, it makes my day to read what he has written. Surely my life is fulfilled because I've had extraordinary teachers, I've had extraordinary colleagues, and I have Joy as my extraordinary student. With these words, you please continue. Thank you. I welcome you all.
Thank you, Vishwa. I think, Joydeep, maybe we should get started with the first session. I think in the first session, we have Professor Vishwa Adluri and is it Ed Butler on the, yeah.
Yeah. Before we go into the first session, I just want to, say a few words. This is not long, and it is not, the plan for today is not to engage in a kind of, presentation of a person, but of an idea and a body of work. And we are all here conjoined with that common interest in an intellectual project. And my only recollection or the reminiscence I want to share is that I met Vishwa a very, very long time ago at the new school, and I saw him around in a few classes. And he had been Rainer Schurman's student. Obviously, that was the new school of old. The level of reading and things they did was just staggering. There's this story they tell about Gadamer, where apparently after he met Heidegger, he despaired of ever being a philosopher and he thought he should quit and do something else. And obviously he didn't, and then he continued and was Heidegger's student, and is himself now a philosopher of some recognition. And in fact, in my opinion, he has a better grasp of the history of philosophy than Heidegger. You see how I'm mixing up the two. And I had something of a similar experience. So it's we will at the end sort of go over some biographic things, affiliations, influences, but I just wanted to start off with that recollection that when I met Vishwa, it was almost a sign to me to stop, because I realized I could never match that level of philosophical reading, insight, brilliance. And I just decided I would be a aid and an asset and a supporter, because I realized here was an intellectual project that was greater than my personal, philosophical interests, and that it was worth doing that. When I was preparing for this webinar, I also looked at a lot of the old writings and things that haven't been published. So what you have seen, the 3 or 4 books, are the tip of the iceberg. And it was a humbling and saddening experience for me, because I saw how much work there is on the Greeks, how much work on the pre-Socratics, papers on Oedipus, papers on Sophocles and Socrates and Homer and so on, that never saw the light of day, because we had to set all of that aside and pick up this battle with Indology. So not just at the personal level of time or money or effort, but also at an intellectual level, enormous sacrifices were made to pose this counter to Indology. But I think it was important. I think this is one of the largest intellectual traditions of the world. It is certainly the largest surviving tradition of the ancient world that we have. And to restore it to its place and to engage in a dialogue, not a monologue, not a diatribe against it, I think is a larger project we're all proud to be part of. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ed and Vishwa, and Ed has sort of description and a set of questions for Vishwa on the first session.
Thank you, Joy. So we have the first session, which is the ancient Greek beginnings. So Professor Ed Butler and will have a conversation with Vishwa, and we will gain some insight into Vishwa Adluri's thought on ancient Greeks. Professor Ed Butler, thank you.
Thank you. Without being repetitive of the things that Joydeep just said, I'd just like to briefly reminisce myself. I met Vishwa, I think it was probably somewhere around 1996 at the New School, and we immediately hit it off. Both of us being uncharacteristically for that institution interested in ancient thought, and both of us being interested in what I'm sure our fellow students at the New School thought of as weird religion. But I was immediately struck in a very profound way by Vishwa's extraordinary insight and philosophical acumen. And the profundity of my respect for his work has only grown over the years that I've known him and that I've been privileged to work together with him on a number of projects. And I think that, looking back at some of his earlier works, which are in the area of ancient Greek philosophy, which is my own area of specialization, I agree with Joy that it's important to bring out some of the philosophical foundations that were laid there and the way in which that's been carried forward as a single project and continues to inform the work that he does today. And so with that, just a few preliminary remarks. Vishwa Adluri's first published works were concerned with ancient Greek philosophy, and these works displayed a philosophical orientation that has grounded his subsequent work in important ways, some of which I would like to briefly discuss here. Vishwa's earliest works are already marked by an incisive critique of the preconceptions current in the academic approach to their topics, a critique which he has subsequently carried with powerful effect into the field of Indology. Vishwa's earliest works allow us to appreciate the deep roots of this critical attitude in his concern for the relationship between philosophy and the experience of the divine. Vishwa is concerned to clear the obstacles that academic readings have placed in the way of our recognition of the experience of philosophical salvation, a salvation, that is, which is peculiar to the project of philosophical inquiry, and which is at once closely parallel to cultic salvation, but also irreducible to it. As Vishwa puts it in one of his first published papers, quote, "At the level of salvation, Platonic philosophy addresses the reader in his singularization to come, that is to say, in his death. To the degree that we share this vital existential concern, the philosophers of ancient Greece become our contemporaries. More urgently, though, than that, these philosophers can lead us to the very threshold of initiation and theophany. It is this, in turn, which lends urgency to the effort to free tradition in its salvific dimension from the oblivion of historicism. One cannot at once be an initiate and a historicist with respect to a salvific tradition. Let us be clear that historical awareness is different from reductive historicism. Hermeneutical historical awareness joins us with a tradition, making us awake to its context and its struggles, while historicist reductionism cuts us off from it, placing us forcibly in its own temporality, one which is incompatible with our individuation and hence with our salvation. This individuating character of mortality is dealt with in much more detail in Parmenides, Plato, and Mortal Philosophy, Return from Transcendence, published in 2011, but based on Vishwa's doctoral dissertation from the New School for Social Research. Here, he argues that mortal life must be understood from out of its own mortal span, and not reduced either to a particular within the horizon of a history, or transformed into information, immortal in the sense of being storable, retrievable, and controllable. Mortal singularity thus places limits both upon the reduction to an historical narrative, such as modernity's linear narrative, of which Vishwa has been critical in many subsequent works, as well as upon the technological alienation and dismemberment of the person, which is strikingly performed in today's social media. There is an experience, thus, in Vishwa's work, which to me is expressive of the situation of many philosophers of our generation, his and mine, I mean, who are paradoxically the inheritors of a tradition of modern Western thought, which is in its very nature disruptive of tradition as such. For many of us, this problematic inheritance took the form of a commitment to engaging with broader, deeper, and older traditions, and discovering for ourselves, often in rather painful fashion, how to make them part of our own living process, a pilgrimage as such, from historicism to initiation. And so now, following on from these points, I'd like to pose a question, or maybe a few interrelated questions, concerning the relationship between philosophical salvation and salvation from other cultic sources. So, in your book on Parmenides, and in subsequent works on Plato, you speak of a gulf separating being and coming to be. You illustrate this quite vividly in your reading of Parmenides' poem, in which you argue that the goddess's logos, quote, negates the youth's journey and his individuality, because from her divine viewpoint, the way to her and the way back are equivalent. Similarly, but from a slightly different angle, I think, you say in a later piece on Plato of Plato having instituted, relative to Homer, as the poet of ceaseless coming to be, quote, a new kind of journey, linear rather than cyclical, an ascent rather than a nautical voyage, a true being at home rather than a homecoming, and a rational self-identification with the noetic part of the soul, rather than being driven by the thumotic soul. Now, as a fellow specialist, I'm interested in what sort of different value the thumos, the passionate part of the soul, has in Plato, as distinct from its role in Parmenides, where you see the thumos as the source of concrete individuality for the mortal being. But this might be a little technical for some of our listeners to appreciate. So I'd like to pose another question, and you can take up the former issue to whatever degree you like. This concerns the way in which this opposition between being and becoming, the gulf you speak of, and the separation it entails between the lives of gods and of mortals, plays out in light of your more recent writings on bhakti. In your article, Plotinus and the Orient, in particular, you speak about bhakti as representing the soteriological way up from the many to the one, corresponding to the cosmogonic way down from the one to the many. You speak of this complementarity in terms of pravritti and nivritti dharmas, and it is also present in later Platonic thought as prohodos and epistrophe, the ontological orientations of procession and turning back or conversion, respectively. Does bhakti then truly bridge the gulf between being and becoming? Does bhakti make the relationship between the god and the mortal genuinely reciprocal? Does it create a united plane of experience in which gods and mortals are truly together with one another? And in this light, what is the special task of philosophy, insofar as it is tasked, you say in another piece, with positing the ultimate reference? What belongs to philosophy alone, and what is the philosopher's bhakti? You have to unmute.
A good summary of my work, if not. I'm just surprised that you posed it as a question. Let me just begin with my own journey. When I went to the new school and I wanted to start studying philosophy, there was so much to study and there were so many things to study and so many perspectives. I got a little lost. And one day my professor, Rainer Sherman, took me to his office and told me, you only that which you experience is the true philosophy. So you focus on what you experience. It took me a while just to understand what experience even means. Does it mean simply experiencing the world? And it came to the point that I had lost my mother and there was deep grief about death. I was in medical school and I left medical school because I just felt that the positive sciences did not give an answer of who my mother was and what this love is, that I just do not want another person to play a role in my life that my mother did, or that she was irreplaceable. And then as I was thinking about her, I remember very clearly I had a flashback. It was Ganesh Chaturthi when I was a little kid, and there was a little icon of Ganesh who was being worshipped. He had big ears and, a lot of moxie. Some of those Ganesh icons we get, they have a lot of moxie. So he was sitting there and we had put, greens and so on. And he was sitting there with his feet up with a little mouse. And my mother told me, go salute him and say goodbye because he's leaving. And I was amazed. I just went in, I bowed down, and I thought, he's going away. So I was very sad, and I told my mother I'm very sad about it. And my mother said, don't be silly, he'll be back next year. And then I went back and looked at him and I thought, but it won't be this icon. There'll be some different icon. It won't be this icon. So the iconicity that of this particular thing, this particular, is lost in philosophy when we talk about beings in general, or when we say tree, we mean any tree. When we mean people, we mean any people. And it goes beyond every kind of identity and every kind of classification. So I wanted to articulate that truth of what does it mean to be a singular like that. It did not help that Rainer Schurman, whom I was very fond of, was also dying, was also very ill and was going to die. So this notion of death is central. I had read Plato. Plato says philosophy is preparation for death. So in the Western philosophical paradigm, I found that very little in philosophy had anything to do with death. And that experience of not my death, but the death of those I love, or at least in the case of Ganesha, the icon that will go away and be submerged in water. And so that's where my journey started. And I needed two things. So when I read Parmenides, it was clear to me that there is this thing called permanent being or unchanging being. Let's not call it permanent, unchanging being, which seemed to me, which is in the case of Plato, it is the true, the good, and the beautiful. In the case of Hinduism, it is Satchitananda Brahman. In the case of Plato, the orientation towards that is Dikayosune, or the good, to which Dikayosune or justice leads. In Hinduism, it's Dharma, same thing. So I had all these things in my mind, but I just did not know how to put it. So in my Parmenides book, I just did not know how to put being and beings together, except that the goddess herself had given two separate speeches, one on being and one on becoming. And they were just two speeches. So I felt at that time, and I've changed since, that there is an inseparable gulf between the two. But that gulf was in my head. I didn't know how to bring those two together. It did not occur to me, although I played or I made a big deal about how we should read it in a literary way, the idea of the magic of literature that would put singular beings like Socrates together with philosophical abstract thoughts did. Maybe it occurred to me, maybe it didn't. In the chapter on singularities and Socrates and Phaedrus, I think I went in that direction.
All right, I think he'll be back in a few seconds. Ed, are you still there?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it seems like his signal dropped.
Yeah, so let's keep the thing between you and me. I wanted to say that I obviously.
Oh, he's back.
Okay, he's back.
Path was what Heidegger had blocked. So
if you could go back a little bit, your signal dropped out, and we missed about a minute.
At the end of my Parmenides discussion, in my conclusion there, it shows that I had come to two places. One is that the appreciation of, or the holiness of, the literary form itself. And I had come to initiation, that philosophy ought to be an initiation. It just cannot be something I just read with detachment, because then death is not included, singularity is not included. I did not know how to put those together at that time. When I came to the Mahabharata, it was quite clear, because there are very sophisticated categories in the Mahabharata, unlike the work done in Parmenides and Homer and Plato that you brought up, there is a meditation on the literary form itself as a form of revelation. So there are the four Vedas, the Mahabharata is the fifth Veda, and I could not bridge that gulf between being and beings. But in the case of this notion of avatara, Krishna seemed to have crossed that gulf very easily. So in the way being itself is present in this world, which is also populated by gods everywhere, I was able to think this through. So my second dissertation was precisely an inquiry into this question. How does one read the Mahabharata as if one is being initiated? So the first portion of my Mahabharata work was to read the very few chapters from the beginning. And I found something remarkable, that all the crazy stories in the Adi Parvan are actually meant to disorient and reorient you into the story and how to interpret and read that story. So the text itself was already aware of and performing the fusion of the initiatory as well as the philosophical and the salvific dimensions of thinking in a very wonderful way. This was the PhD thesis I wrote and I submitted at Marburg. The Marburg people said, "What the hell is this? You're religious, you're Indian, you don't know how to think." And so all the rest is history, as they say. Did I miss any specific? As for different aspects of worship, yeah, Krishna says you can worship any god you please, but being itself is present in every worship, which I think you've got from Patricia Curd or so. You have a specific notion on that, and that'll work, Ed, in this scenario. Yeah. So Krishna says, no matter whom you worship, I strengthen that bhakti. So the now circular linear, I keep living in this experiential world. My soul will transmigrate ethically, but there is a notion of liberation and moksha, which is only slightly present, I think, in Plato. For example, in the myth of Ur is not supposed to participate in anything, drink from the waters of unheedfulness and so on, but it's there. But in Mahabharata and especially the Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly worked out. And so there is this notion of going beyond the circular path to a linear path. That linear path is different from the historical linear path of Judeo-Christianity, where it begins with creation and for everybody and ends with an apocalypse for everybody. Here, every individual is on a journey.
You know, I think that one of the things that you bring out here that I really resonates with me is just how incomplete our appreciation of Greek philosophy often is if we're not able to supplement it either from looking at other traditions like Hinduism in your journey, or diverse theological traditions in my experience, even just an attentiveness to ancient Greek religious experience and to the way in which Hellenic polytheism infuses Plato's thought, which I think not only is it, of course, played down to virtually to the point of suppression in academic readings of ancient Greek thought, but it's subtle enough in many ways, just in Plato's own works, that we can read them without really marking the significance of these stray moments where a character in a dialogue says, "By Zeus," or there's a reference to, "Oh, here we are meeting on the day of this festival." Um, and we're taught in the academic reading of these texts to take these references very lightly. And yet in antiquity, there was an understanding that this was actually a constant undercurrent of theological reference that ran throughout Plato's works, and that provides this vital counterpoint in many instances to what's said explicitly. And so a person has to learn to practice a particular kind of reading. And I think that that was something that, in your work on Greek philosophy, you're already very sensitive to, and I think prepared you then to really engage in a fully philosophical way with other texts that you then encountered, where the kind of reference to theophany and to initiation and to salvation is much more explicit and much more direct.
So, so Christianity provides a kind of an agenda, right? Philosophy is not the way to salvation already. So, and I'm a philosopher, so Christianity just loses me there at the get-go. And Christianity, however, to be very fair, Christianity also preserved the texts of the ancient world. Greek texts and so on. And it preserved them. Some say well, some say not so well. And I think because Christianity had this sort of rah-rah moment throughout history, critical scholarship today will say that that appropriation was not innocent and scholarly alone. I would like to share a book I just read, which is called The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. It's written by Catherine Nixie, and she is a fantastic writer. She writes only in 100 and some pages, without the footnotes I get into. Or Joy gets into. She has a very beautiful, popular form of writing. So I thought when I got on the scene that I was only furthering the Western interest in the roots of the Western thought in Plato by restoring to Plato those things that were edited out by the tradition, the Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition. And I thought, here is Mahabharata, an ancient text that has survived to this day, and magnificently so. Just the transmission history of Mahabharata, I mean, scribes having to copy, I mean, it's a very big text. And now we know that it is not even a chaotic text or a text in free fall. So that kind of magnificent intellectual experiment, I thought, would at least provide a control system by which we can revisit and study Plato. Unfortunately, I'm still in that, like, we have that the West, that there are methods and paradigms outside the Western canon. Just to convince people of that is difficult. And there are various systematic things against it, because Christianity is taken as the paradigm on which all other religions are supposed to be explained. Apparently, there is such a thing as religion in the singular, and all religions have to come to the table, sort of purging themselves of everything. My experience of the Enlightenment table, the Marxist table, has been as follows: that everybody, secular table, everybody is invited for dinner, right? The Muslims can come, the Jews can come, the Hindus can come, but there's only one item on the menu, and that would be bratwurst. Now, now, of course, bratwurst is made from a mixture of pork and beef meat. So, of course, the Buddhist, the Hindu, the Muslim will not eat that. So the minute they don't eat that, they reveal themselves as not fit for that paradigm. It's a crazy example, but it's an example. So you're right. In Plato, there are so many things. For example, the whole Republic is read as the monument to political philosophy without ever mentioning that that Socrates is there to pray at the temple and the ceremony and the festival of a foreign goddess from Thrace, Venice. And Plato just points those things, And just last week, I was looking at the syllabus of Phaedo from a university in California, and the professor had said, please don't read the last portion of the Phaedo, because Plato involves himself in a very bizarre description of the underworld, which is just not interesting. That's where Plato stops being a philosopher. So you're absolutely right. I mean, and I'm hoping that with the Mahabharata studies, we can question certain prejudices in the bottom of the humanities, so that even Western humanities can profit from that. The blind spots, as they say, when you look at just the mirror, rear view mirror, there's a blind spot. And I think looking at the Eastern tradition, Mahabharata is about as important as that having to look over your shoulder to change lanes.
Can
Yes,
I?
I was just going to say
Ed,
briefly.
go ahead. I'll come back with my question.
It's first, of course we lacked so much of the infrastructure for understanding Plato, because we may have Homer, but we have virtually nothing in the way of liturgical writings from ancient Greece. Texts like the Orphic scriptures, which were very widely distributed in antiquity, survive for us only in fragments. Because the preservation of the ancient Greek texts by Christians was, of course, highly selective. But another thing that we see in Plato is the importance that he ascribes to the thought of other peoples, the respectful way in which he approaches ancient Egypt, for instance, the reverent way often that he speaks of.
It also in Homer. Yeah, also in Homer, you have the Zeus going off to have his meals with the Ethiopians and stuff, whoever they are, and the land.
Right. Poseidon, actually.
Poseidon, and who's the one?
Every year traveling to Ethiopia.
And there is also the land of the lotus eater. I think
it was
Joy
a very
had
interconnected world in antiquity.
Yeah, I think Joy had a point, and then go ahead, Joy.
I just want, one of the things that has struck me throughout when I read your work, when I read Ed's work, and I think of Ed as also one of the people who has taught me tremendous amounts.
Me too.
I remember this conversation the first time you'd come to Vish's house and you were seated on the yellow couch. And I sort of asked you, I know you're a worship of the Hellenic gods, but to my knowledge, what we have preserved is such a small amount compared to Hinduism, where there's actually a sort of tradition and we know how to perform the rituals and so on. And here the tradition has been broken down. And so how what are your sources? And you answered in the most staggering way possible. It just blew my mind, and I don't think you intended to. But you said, those whom the gods call to their service, they're always present, and they institute their worship. And I was making this error as someone who was very critical of historicism, who had read a lot about historicism and the historic reduction that is done, that, everything is a human creation. All worship is just anthropocentric. It's just instituted by humans as social control, and we can only understand it in political terms. And I have been critical of that. And yet historicism so sort of dominates our understanding that, to me, without a historical mediation, it wasn't possible. And so I realized that even as someone who has been critiquing historicism, there are levels of deconstruction or sort of levels of removal that have to be done before we understand the immediate presence of divinity, and to define it in the simplest way possible, that we are not living in a world made up of humans alone. Significations are not purely human significations. And that is what, 2 millennia of Christianity have effectively done, is they have gone to other traditions and said, yesterday I was working on Paul Harker, for example, and he has this article that it's not the church in India, it's the one before that in the volume, where he says, we have to distinguish between true theology, dogmatic theology, which is what St. Paul has. And then obviously there's an anthropological side of religion. Yeah, the ancient Greeks were religious. They had some noble feelings. And some of that can be reused. They were obviously searching for the truth, but revelation was not given to them. And that kind of, anthropologizing, historicizing of other people's traditions and saying, well, when you bow down to, let's say, Shiva or Vishnu, you're obviously searching for something, but that's your posit, that's your creation, and you have not, and your work has consistently shown me this notion of the who, that the God is a person, and the God is not a posit, a what that I posit, has been very, very important for me. And I think Hinduism still suffers under that need to give a what account, I see this on the internet many times. One example is to say that we have many gods, but we all worship the one true God. This is not a statement of Hinduism that a traditional Hindu would recognize. This is Hinduism in dialogue with Christianity, which has accused it of polytheism or idolatry, and is trying to, twist itself into the Cinderella slipper and say, I'm beautiful. So I want to. I see
So that's why I'm more interested in the genealogy, conceptual genealogy of even terms such as monotheism and polytheism, right? No worshipper of Ganesha thinks himself as I am a polytheist or I am a monotheist. Nor does anyone in Hinduism worship any god without the concept of Brahman included in that concept. So I just feel that the conceptual vocabulary, which has been going on for 1,500 years in Europe, has run its course and has become so problematic that in Europe itself, we have declared that the Judeo-Christian God is dead. This is Nietzsche writing in 1908, towards the end of the 19th century. So when that has happened, why not rethink all our terms and all our concepts? And what better way than to dialogue with Hinduism, which is a different paradigm from the paradigm of Judeo-Christianity and Islam, which are hermeneutics of the same book. And this will get Europe, it is not just an Indian project. Europe itself can appreciate its roots and its origins in the Greeks and in the Greek religion and Greek philosophy through that, by sort of dumping these so many conceptual coins that have become erased. I mean, they've been so overused that, these words don't have any semantic value anymore. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything, and I'd hesitate to say that there's anything providential in so much destruction of ancient heritage, which has occurred in the West and in other cultures through the actions of the West. But I will say this, that it is imposed upon those of us like myself who have returned to the worship of the gods, the necessity, as Joydeep was saying, of finding ways to engage with the living persons of the gods, because we don't have a continuous tradition. Our traditions, whatever gods were called to, in so many cases, the tradition has been sundered. And so we're thrown back upon the attempt to inhabit the same space somehow with the gods, to bring ourselves into contact with their living presence. And it provides a particular perspective because one doesn't have the infrastructure of ritual practice meticulously handed down, which is a treasure and an incalculable and inestimable gift that India possesses, a more intact and continuous tradition than perhaps anywhere else in the world. I think probably than anywhere else in the world. But one thing that it can
jump in for 1 second. I've been talking to people that come up and ask me about Hinduism, and many of them are Hindu. Almost all the questions that Hindus have about Hinduism are the questions Westerners created out of their system. And in a way, Christianity's tragedy is that it won. It won so unequivocally in the West that, absent all dialogue, it fell prey to secularism and to the phenomenon of death of God. So if Christianity itself has to survive, it needs a dialogue with Hinduism, especially on terms that are not part of its own vocabulary, because those have been exhausted, right? So suppose I'm very clever and I defeat everybody in the room and they've all left and I'm sitting by myself and I can't even talk to myself. Somebody comes in. I'm supposed to now not do the same thing I did before as to outwit them and get them out of the room. I should learn a new humility, a new language, and begin answering questions. Is Christianity monistic or dualistic? Simple question. Simple question. And the miracle in the Trinity, am I the fourth? Is the individual soul the fourth entity? Is faith disconnected from reason or not? Is my soul already predestined to be saved, or is it not? Do I believe in a soul, or is it just the resurrection of the body? Do I believe in the authority of the Catholic Church, or don't I? You know, when all these questions are not answered, and a Christian enters with a camera, enters into a dialogue with a Hindu and says, do you really think a big Ganesha can ride on a little mouse? We are not at the level of science. We are not at the level of even tourism, because a tourist would take a very good picture of that.